All right, so continuing from a unfortunately long delayed session of lessons we've been discussing regarding rhetoric. Rhetoric is, of course, the art of communication and, of course, the ability to communicate effectively. This, of course, involves a number of factors that we've been trying to inform you about, not just in regards to spotting logical fallacies, but also being aware of the ways that people, maybe even unintentionally, ourselves included, miscommunicate or even miss the point of communication. Now, when we're talking about today's topic, which will be filibustering, it's mostly going to be on the receiving end as far as the one who's listening to someone else. That was our first lesson in rhetoric, is not just to talk, but to listen. But what's interesting is that when you find yourself listening and listening and listening some more, and you wonder, A, where has all the time gone, and B, almost as if this speech was intended to use up said time, we feel that we haven't gotten anywhere. The purpose of rhetoric, sound communication, has failed. So what we want to equip you all for in this lesson is how to not only spot but counter filibustering. Now, filibustering isn't necessarily a logical fallacy. There will be fallacies that will accompany them, but what it's going to mostly involve is just talking for talking's sake for a number of reasons. We talked earlier this week of Dr. Phil's session, who, in order to prevent his guest from voicing any sort of message that would go against his narrative, he talked slowly and passively and put himself in a position where if there was any interruption for the time he himself was wasting, he would then victimize himself and say, if you'd stop interrupting me, and then go on to speak as if he was Treebeard from Lord of the Rings. So the taking up deliberately of time to either use up what time you may have, or in other situations to put yourself in a situation where, as we say before the broadcast, you don't even remember what was being talked about. It is meant, and this is the intent, this is the issue, to deceive through the taking up or the wasting of time.
Which is what actually distinguishes this one from the other ones we have talked about. So the other ones we've talked about, whether they be the ad hominem fallacy or any of these others that we've gone over during our rhetoric lessons, a lot of these could be done accidentally. You're not really aware that you are doing them. It just kind of comes out by instinct. This one is intentional. Yeah, this one, you can't accidentally do this.
You're being slimy.
Right, exactly. So as Sean said, the intent is either to waste time or it is to intentionally confuse the person that you are talking to from forgetting their original point. And you could do this by either talking slowly or utilizing a lot of information that's not even relevant to the conversation. I'm going to give you an example of that in 1 second, but utilizing information that's not really relevant, utilizing a lot of allusions to big words and things that you are familiar with to draw attention away from what you aren't very familiar with. And if you want to see this, a masterclass on this, just watch the White House press secretary do their job. It doesn't matter which one. Could be the current one, could be the one that was under Donald Trump, anyone you want. This is literally their job. It's to filibuster, to distract, to diffuse, to make the reporter themselves, whose job it is to get information from them, to forget what the heck they were even talking about, right? To distract from what I don't want to talk about by moving the conversation to an area that has no relevance, right? So as Sean said, it's a type of red herring almost, right? Where red herring is I'm bringing up facts that, again, aren't very relevant to the topic at hand in order to distract you from what I'm really trying to do, which is to redirect the conversation to a place where I feel more comfortable and I can dominate you. Right. Now, if you see this in interpersonal relationships, it's that you're in an abusive relationship, right? So this is a very strong manipulation tactic. If you find yourself trying to have conversations with the person that you care about and they are constantly redirecting the conversations, going into long tangents that have nothing to do with what you're pointing out in them, if every single time you try to point out something that they're doing wrong, they redirect to you or they talk about something totally unrelated and they just go on and on and on, you're like, I think that went well. I'm not sure. I don't remember what we were talking about, right? If you find yourself saying that a lot, this is happening to you. So,
and note, it doesn't mean you're not allowed to ramble or have banter, but if you address something serious and in order to answer it, they take up a lot of time and make, to quote the famous play, Much Ado About Nothing. You're seeing this at work.
Yeah. So this is an article came out this week. We live in this great time in American history where I could find an article any day of the week I want that does this fallacy. But this is a Separating Sports by Sex Doesn't Make Any Sense by Maggie Mertens, and this is on The Atlantic. So that might sound odd to you because you're like, wait, the thing that human beings have been doing since the dawn of sports doesn't make any sense? So all human beings until the last 5 minutes were just wrong, and men and women are actually completely comparable when it comes to athletic ability? Well, let's hear her reasoning, okay? So she made the claim.
First rule rhetoric, listen.
So hopefully she has a reason for making this claim. Decades of research have shown that sex is far more complex than we may think. And though sex differences in sports show advantages for men, researchers today still don't know how much of this attributes to biological differences versus the lack of support provided to women athletes to reach their highest potential. Science is increasingly showing how sex is dynamic. It has multiple aspects and also shifts. For example, social experiences can actually change levels of sex-related hormones like testosterone in our bodies in a second-to-second and month-to-month way. Sari Van Anders, the research chair in the social neuroendocrinology at Queen's University in Ontario, told me by email. She said that this is complexity means that it doesn't make sense to separate sex by sport. Sport by sex.
Okay, now we're back to the topic again. Thank goodness. Okay, what else did she say?
In order to protect women athletes from getting hurt. If safety was a concern and there was evidence to select certain bodily characteristics to base safety cutoffs, then you would see, say, shorter men excluded from, and then she goes on from there. So if you notice, this whole thing is this, not fallacy, but this rhetoric technique, the slimy technique of redirecting and filibustering, where if you really listen to the content, she really hasn't said anything of substance. All she said is, well, this topic is much more complicated than we thought.
And what is the topic? Women in sports, or gender playing a role in sports, not making any sense. Then goes on to basically spend 2 paragraphs saying that we don't have any sense to gender, and therefore we should demonize and segregate people on the basis of physical ability, which is the opposite of what you're trying to prove, and then segues into a private conversation they had with someone else who disagrees with them.
Who's a neuroendocrinologist, right? This is not a biologist. This is not a sports therapist. This is someone who literally deals with the mind, right?
But I had a lot of syllables.
Right. And the idea is that maybe men compete at a higher level than women because women haven't received enough affirmation. They don't believe they can, so they don't, right?
Hypothetical, not actually an example, right? Okay.
Right. And so this is, again, it's a very good example of someone just redirecting, filibustering, going off on tangents, things like that. So the good news about this one is, like I said, it's everywhere. It's very easy to find examples of this all over the place. It is literally how reporters and how the news is basically run today. But how do we respond to this? So it's a simple problem with an equally actually simple solution. How do you respond to someone who is clearly filibustering?
Well, like we said, the 2 issues we're going to be addressing, how to spot it and how to deal with it. How you deal with it is actually first to spot it, because if you know you're in quicksand, the first thing to do is to understand that fact. If you continue walking and realize, why am I getting shorter? That's because you aren't aware of there being a problem. If you start to notice that either the topic has not been addressed or isn't being addressed for a prolonged length of time, you see me, if you're listening on Reach Radio, you weren't graced with it, but just kind of looking around waiting for sports to come up and this gender presence within it, you can simply ask a question. Okay, but what does that have to do with what we're talking about? All you have to do is point out that the topic that's being discussed isn't being discussed. And just like identifying the fact that you're being filibustered, the moment that you point that out, the jig is up, and they'll have to do either one of 2 things: apologize, which is rare, or they'll continue to filibuster, and you can keep employing this counter. Great, but what does that have to do with blank? Great, but what does that have to do with what we're talking about? Great, but what does that have to do with what we're being here
And
for?
this is a very difficult thing. If you ever watch debates, especially Christian versus atheist debates or Christian versus Muslims debates, this technique is utilized a lot.
Which is why they
debates.
have set time limits.
That's right. And when you're watching debates, sometimes you can get confused, and sometimes what the other person will say is they'll be like, "You didn't respond to any of my claims that I made just a little bit ago." Well, yeah, because none of your claims had anything to do with the topic of debate, right? But they'll claim victory over the person they're debating because they didn't address any of their claims that have nothing to do with the topic that they were debating, which leads to one of my favorite proverbs, and I quote it often. So in Proverbs chapter 26, Solomon lays out for us what we could call a no-win situation, right? So there are instances in which you just can't win, right? So this is Proverbs 26, verse 4. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. So if you have someone filibustering, coming up with really complicated, nonsensical things that have nothing to do with what you're talking about, and you keep trying to redirect them to the actual point of contention, understand, if you try to go along with this person and their crazy spiderwebbing, different topics that they're shotgunning at you, you're going to get lost. You're going to be like them, right? They now own the conversation. They now own you, and they're going to win, right? He who dictates the terms of an engagement will always win. So if you go along with them, you will become like them, and they will beat you. But if you don't answer them according to their folly, if you don't follow around their weird, nonsensical train of thought, they will be right in their own eyes. They will think that they have won. That's okay. Sometimes it's better to just let people think that they have won. So again, if you watch it wasn't really a debate, but the show where Lila Rose was on with Dr. Phil, you'll notice she does this. Lila Rose is an amazing woman. She has a lot of grace within her public appearances. I don't know how she keeps her cool in a lot of these circumstances, but she's very, very good at it. You'll notice that she does exactly what Sean says. She keeps redirecting Dr. Phil, not just to his weird claims, but to the facts, right? Actually, 96% of scientists have said that life begins at conception. And Dr. Phil goes off on weird tangents. She keeps bringing it back to the point, and eventually she just lets him finish. She lets him be right in his own eyes, because there's no sense in continuing to bang your head against the wall when the other person is clearly not into it. So
and
this is
when you're
important.
Deliberately put in a crowd position where everyone's going to disagree with you anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So part of rhetoric, part of learning how to dialogue with people is actually... part of it is learning when to stop, right? Learning when to say, like, I'm not really getting anywhere. There's really nothing coming out of this. I'm going to stop dialoguing with this person because it's just not providing anything, right? So once again, we can't just cut people off because we think that they're being rude or they're not communicating with us the way that we would like. We should give them a chance, but there is a limit to the graciousness you should provide. People like this, people who employ the filibustering tactic, they will take up as much of your time as you will let them, right? And that could be an awful lot, because a lot of these people love to hear the sound of their own voice. So if you engage with them, they're very good at this, and it will just waste all of your time.
And we'll leave you with this note, again, in the book of Proverbs, chapter 29 and verse 11. This is a good character check to prevent you from becoming the kind of filibuster we want to avoid. Don't be a Phil. That has layers to it. A fool vents all his feelings, but a wise man holds them back. The goal of a conversation isn't to talk the most, it's to talk with the most meaning. If you can communicate more with less, then you're all the better for it. So following our own advice, we will end on that note and look forward to our next rhetoric lesson. But let us know if you have questions about that, and we'll continue next week with more.